We are here at the remarkable Ralston College in Savannah, Georgia, with the students of this year's class. We have delivered the series of Sophia lectures, and we're very much looking forward to hearing what's on your minds.
Well, I just want to say a really big thank you to the two of you. I've been listening to your podcast since 2020, and it's been such a source of wisdom and great information. And it's just the thing I think about the most with it is how much I feel hopeful and how it brings this sort of like good humor, even as you take so many issues so seriously. There's always a sense of action and pragmatism, and it just makes me feel a little bit more as if I know how to go about life. So huge thank you. Maybe I'll pass it on to another question.
I had a question about what you mentioned at the Sophia lectures yesterday. Specifically that there's no philosophical grounding that life is better than death. I thought the reason you gave was that we who are conscious have kind of passed that along culturally, that idea, because it makes sense with certain presumptions. But I was wondering about how non-sentient life, the people that you didn't, like the animals and plants that you didn't mention, they seem to also desire life and strive for life. So wouldn't that be philosophical grounding for the importance of life?
That's a great question. Really, the point I was trying to make is that it is not surprising to find living creatures biased in this way universally. Yes, all the other creatures are constructed to preserve their own lives, to pass on life to future generations. That does not say that in some deep sense that the living matter of the universe is superior to the non-living matter. How would you even make the comparison? It's just that you would expect a strong bias, given that each generation, those that pursue the continuation of their lives in one way or another, are bound to outcompete those that fail to do so. It's one of these productive tautologies.
I'm curious about what point you two believe the inorganic world turns into the organic world. At what point does sentience or consciousness or life enter into the cosmos?
Like at what point in time, or?
Sure, yeah. Or how does life begin? I know in the Christian conception, there's the idea that God breathed life into man, and it was a divine external force. But in the scientific or the philosophical paradigm that you both operate in, I'm wondering where you view life as entering into the world or enter into being.
We don't know, and we may never know. And the reason that we don't know is that the history erases evidence. Information is destroyed by time. And the things that we do know about the history of life on Earth are heavily biased in favor of things that, for example, tend to fossilize. Right? So we have much better information about things that have bones than we do about things that don't. And what we know about the initial starting point of life is that there wasn't really anything to fossilize. We might get lucky. There may have been a preservation of something, some kind of information that we would be able to read and understand, but it's very likely that it just simply wasn't captured. But we can say some things about what it was likely about. And in my Sophia lecture, my first one, I was arguing that two things have to come together in order to set that cascade in motion. And once they do, the rest of it, not the particulars, not what creatures will evolve, but the fact of evolution becomes inevitable. The first prerequisite is the kind of selection that exists in the pre-organic universe. And the next thing is some kind of heredity, which is just simply the passing of some information from one generation, whatever that means, to the next. So, for example, you can think of the crystalline structure of a snowflake. A snowflake starts with atoms that arrange based on basically a chemical angle in every water molecule that freezes in place at the point that the temperature drops. Once a small number of water molecules have aligned in this way, it predisposes the rest of the snowflake to form in a pattern, and the patterns are highly variable. So there is some kind of information being passed in a way that could be argued to be something like heredity in the initial seeding of that crystal and then the growth of it, right? The first molecules laid down predispose a particular crystal that eventually becomes large enough to see it with the naked eye. That kind of process, coupled with the selection of different patterns in the universe, has all of the ingredients necessary to begin the cascade. And what the particulars were, we don't know, and we may never.
And there is a disjunction there, like there is a step, right, from abiotic to biotic, and therefore from that which doesn't strive to get into the future into that which does. And that, I think, for many, and maybe this is at the heart of the question here, is too big of a leap to imagine without there being an additional force that creates the striving. We are trying to explain it without the striving, without an additional force in the most parsimonious way possible, but the evidence is not weak, but just absent because time erases evidence.
If I might just add, I hear in a lot of questions a desire to compare the accounts of how things began, and was there, an intentional impetus to the living universe or the universe as a whole. And it is important to realize that the resistance that you get on the idea of an intentional universe is philosophically required given the state of the evidence. The point I would make very simply is this. We have a problem. It is hard to say how the universe began. One solution to that problem might be that somebody set it in motion. However, if they did, then we have an even bigger problem than we were trying to solve by invoking that creator. The problem is, if a universe is hard to explain, then somebody who can make one is even harder to explain. And so it is that increase it is a massive decrease in parsimony to invoke that creator without explaining where they came from. And so, as rigorous scientists, we're required to just say, well, the evidence points us in the direction of no creator. At the moment that the creator wishes to provide evidence, then we have a new question, and it would be the first one I'd ask him.
And yet, for all the discussion of parsimony, which we have to be thinking about if we're trying to infer deep histories, those relationships, the best evidence we're going to have is what is the simplest explanation given the evidence. But the very things about which we are most interested, what brings the usual suspects together such that you have play across many different instantiations, even just on this earth, are exactly instances of non-parsimony. So when does convergence happen across organisms? That's some of the most interesting stuff out there. And those are exactly instances that are more difficult to explain than parsimony would suggest. And so we have to be open to the idea that there are non-parsimonious explanations out there at every level, because we know that there are at many levels that we can see.
I'm wondering if that's confusing. It's the fact that it would be unparsimonious. If birds and bats inherited their wings from a shared common ancestor, it creates a non-parsimonious interpretation of the evidence. It is, in this case, more parsimonious, even though you have two evolutions and that's complex. It's better than having to correct the record for all of the things that would have to be true for birds and bats to have had a flying ancestor. So it is ultimately parsimonious.
But the question is, what don't we yet know? Right? Like what is the evidence that we can't yet see? And if we could see it, would it reveal a different interpretation of origins, for instance?
Two things I'm curious about would be the fossil record and the so-called missing, the transition creatures or whatever their name is, and then also what do you make of the reliability or unreliability of carbon dating? These are two issues that young Earth creationists I know often levy against the evolutionary account, and I just want to hear what do you make of kind of how do we think about gathering evidence?
First thing I would say is the gappiness of the fossil record is, to our way of thinking, exactly what you would expect. And for some reasons that are maybe counterintuitive, but easy to understand once you spot them. If you imagine that what sets loose a rapid exploration of some kind of design, right? You have the first bat that is capable of flight, and suddenly it opens up a bunch of potential niches that can be filled with some new animal. Well, that innovation, imagine what it looked like, an animal who could just barely power their flight. They started out presumably from a glider, and they just barely crossed that transition where they can keep themselves aloft. Well, suddenly, anything that contributes to their ability to do that is going to be accumulated by selection. And so what that will look like to us in retrospect is evolution on fast forward. Now, the reason that we don't see those intermediate forms is while evolution is happening on fast forward, no population of any of those intermediates gets very large. And if you put yourself through the thought experiment of if an animal dies on Earth today, out in the woods somewhere, what are the chances it becomes a fossil? They're virtually zero. What's going to happen to that animal is its body is going to be broken apart by scavengers, by creatures that eat dead tissue. It's going to be lost. It's going to be like that information that gets erased by time. Only very rarely does something strange happen where some creature dies and falls into a bog where there's no oxygen, and so it doesn't decay or get torn apart by scavengers. So you need a large population of something before any individual is likely to end up fossilized. And even when an individual gets fossilized, the chances that we moderns know where to look for it is pretty low. So you would expect you're only going to see creatures that became widespread. Those are going to be creatures that are already pretty well done marching along that path of increased adaptation. And so you would expect a gappy fossil record. In fact, if it wasn't gappy, you'd have to ask if somebody was putting one over on us. Is that a fair answer?
Yeah.
And I would just to pick up on that, I think that's right. It's sort of a statistical argument with regard to we expect more things to fossilize when they were more numerous in the first place. But I think the surprise that people have about gappiness in the fossil record is the opposite surprise that I have for exactly these statistical reasons, which is I'm actually surprised that there is a fossil record at all, if anything, because the chances of, just as Bret said, of anything fossilizing, of having exactly the right conditions, of having there be no disturbance at all under conditions of no oxygen perhaps, and of no geological disruption for so much time, and amounts of time that are basically impossible to conceive of, makes it shocking, actually, that there are as many fossils as there are.
And actually, I realize you asked more of a question than I answered initially. I think there are things about the evidence that we've been given that actually do point to something wrong with our model. I don't think our evolutionary model is complete. And the one I would say causes me to rethink is the so-called waiting time evidence, where calculations about how much genetic change is required and how long that's likely to have taken compared to how long we think the evolution of these creatures required. Now, I don't think it points toward a creator. I think there is a much better explanation, which is that there is a layer of Darwinism that we don't yet know about. That there is something, and it's important to point out, it is a Darwinian layer that I'm thinking of, something that accelerates this process so it can happen much more efficiently than you would expect based on the model that you probably saw in your biology textbook. The idea that there are random mutations, that those random mutations are generally bad. Occasionally one is good. Sometimes when a good one exists, selection is capable of seeing it and it accumulates and it spreads, and that causes the alteration in protein coding genes that changes the form of the creature, and over time it becomes more fit for the environment. That is a very slow and cumbersome process. There may be ways, in fact, I think it is almost tautological that there will be ways in which the earliest evolved creatures evolved ways of enhancing the efficacy of their search so that they find better forms quicker. And that would account for why the evidence suggests that random mutation is not a fast enough process to have produced the creatures we see in the time that they had.
And that's something we call explorer modes. And you see it too, not just we think, in deep time, but also in individuals like the vertebrate neuronal exploration that I talked about yesterday, where in many cases so much more gets laid down, and that can look like waste, that can look like inefficiency and waste, or it can look like best to do more first and then find out what is needed and what is useful, and then trim away what isn't useful. And so, fill the niches, fill the places, and then let what works remain.
When Heather says, we call that explorer modes, Heather and I call that explorer modes.
Yeah.
The field ridicules the idea, but that's the nature of science. Ultimately, it will either be borne out or it won't.
I take a lot of time thinking about convergent evolution, and that organisms tend to follow similar forms. There's even this theory that the macrocoptera and the microcoptera evolved flight independently of one another. And there's examples of this in like many different organisms where it almost seems as if they already had this potentiality to do wings or poison or whatever before, and then when the pressure goes onto those organisms, they actually evolve into these. They evolve wings independently, even though they're both genetically the same. What do you make of this sort of that almost as if the organism has some sort of like potentiality already within it?
There are 9 good questions in there. Yep. First of all, you're right to spend a lot of time thinking about convergent evolution, right? We only really know why natural selection does what it does when it repeats itself more than once, so we can say something about the conditions that cause it. I don't think, at least not generally, I don't believe that this is the result of the fact that there's some sort of directionality inside creatures, although we do have a term for the kind of convergent evolution that happens when 2 creatures depart from an ancestor and travel a similar route to a similar place. So that is a kind of convergent evolution, but we call that parallelism. Right? They've traveled in parallel. But in general, I think what you're really seeing when animals or plants or fungi come up with a solution that looks very similar in 2 different clades at 2 different times, what you're seeing is that these evolutionary trajectories are all constrained by a design space in which the rules aren't set by biology in general. Ultimately, they're set by physics and chemistry. And so it is not surprising that if evolution is an effective force, that it finds the same solution and that it can look shockingly similar. Because effectively, for the same reason that, a Russian jet fighter and an American jet fighter come to look very similar, it's like there aren't that many ways you can design it that work out. You're going to find a way that is, the best compromise between efficiency, agility, robustness. Those things will be balanced by nature or by designers in similar ways.
And yet there are some examples that are so extreme that they would seem to confound, that they do confound us for a while. So you mentioned bats and you mentioned the evolution of poisons. And the example which I am most familiar with comes from the poison frogs. The dart poison frogs in the New World, with which many people will be familiar with, these beautiful, small, brightly colored frogs that have elaborate parental care, elaborate social systems, territoriality. They defend these wells of water in plants. And in some species, after a fertilized egg, after an egg is laid inside the well and it hatches out and there's a tadpole there, the mother comes back and feeds the tadpoles unfertilized eggs for them to eat. You don't expect this sort of thing in frogs. And then over in Madagascar, and they are diurnal, which most frogs aren't. They're brightly colored, and they have this neurotoxin that is otherwise almost unknown on the planet, which if you get a little on your lips, it'll go numb, and if you eat it, depending on the frog, you might die very quickly. And then in Madagascar, there are frogs of which everything I just said is also true. And for a long time, it was thought, well, obviously, with that many characters in common, it must be, including that it's exactly the same poisons that they make, exactly the same chemical poisons that they make. Oh, well, it must be the same. Like, what are the chances? Well, it turns out that the ecological conditions are similar enough, and the building blocks for the poisons are from the same diet that they have. They're both eating ants and mites from which they get the chemical building blocks of exactly the same neurotoxins that they create, which then allows them to be diurnal, which then allows them to be colorful, which then allows them to hang out in daylight and not have to worry about predators. And you can tell a story that is a story, but if you keep on pressure testing it and saying, well, what about this? What about this? What about this? And it works. And then you also use the kind of tools that I was talking about on the first day, molecular and morphological and developmental tools to say, well, are they really each other's closest relatives? And you find really, really not. It's just extraordinary convergence across so many characters. So that's one of the stories that we happen to know pretty well. But I imagine, I hope, I think that there are so many more stories like that we don't know, that we haven't discovered yet.
And actually, your point about the question of whether or not the Chiroptera, the bats, are really one clade or two, that is now a settled question, as settled as questions get in science. And the story of how it happened and how it got settled it really tells the tale. So the question of whether or not the megabats and the microbats are really both from the same evolution of flight was initiated by a scientist named Pettigrew, who was a neurobiologist. And he looked at the megabats and he said the brains of these animals look much more like primates than they do like other microbats. And he reasoned that it would be much more likely for the wings under the pressure of physics to converge on the same form, and that really the brains of these animals were telling us that they were not organized on the phylogenetic tree the way we thought. Well, the molecular evidence eventually proved that he was incorrect. And it revealed that the brains had diverged. And the most logical reason to think this is that the microbats echolocate, all of them. The megabats do not. And so the question is, how is it that the brain should look if you're processing information about the world around you in these two radically different ways? So the megabat brains had converged on primate brains because primates are visually orienting and the megabats are visually orienting, and the microbat brains look different because the pressure from echolocation had caused them to be so. And when Pettigrew finally, after a decade of battling over this question, surrendered, he said, if it is a wrong hypothesis, it has been a most fruitful wrong hypothesis, which is exactly the way one should deal with this in science. You fight for the idea only as long as it makes sense to, and the fact that we learned a tremendous amount about bats generally, we learned a lot about brains, we learned a lot about flight, that was productive. That's the way it's supposed to work.
And then, so I had a question about the last point, or about one of the closing points you had yesterday in the lecture. You said something along the lines of, man is like that. Human beings are living in a world for which, like, they're not made, or like they're living in a world for which they're not made. And I thought that was really interesting from the intellectual standpoint. That the reason I'm asking about that is because in the Ethics, when Aristotle is defining happiness, he posits an active life and a contemplative life after that, and he thinks that contemplating things like the highest truths is like where man is going to find true happiness. But what he says is really fascinating, because he says that and a life of this sort, the contemplative life, would exceed what is a human, because his argument is that if true happiness is found in contemplation, and man isn't able to contemplate all day, like he has to sleep in things, and it seems like true happiness isn't meant for this earth. And I thought that was really interesting, where you were saying that it seems like man is too conscious for the world we live in. And I was curious what your thoughts are, because you said positing a creator it opens up new problems for evolution about how to explain everything. But do you think, and kind of echoing off of one of the last questions, is there some sort of supernatural end man has? Like, why does man have so much intellect? Is it just some random fluke? Do you think there is something to be said for that?
I mean, I think the the simplest answer is that it has paid tremendous dividends again and again for human beings to ponder what is true and to hold each other's feet to the fire. What is not obvious about people is that our capacity to contemplate it's powerful within an individual, but that's nothing compared to what happens when we pool our insight and understanding and push each other around. So there is the individual contemplating, but there is also some analog that we don't have good language for, which is sort of the state of our collective understanding of things that gets passed between individuals, between cultures, down through generations. And that thing, it makes us a radically different creature than we were 1,000 years ago. At this point, the rate of change is so great that we are a radically different creature than we were less than a lifetime ago. And that is why I was suggesting we have been forced into this hyper-conscious mode where every day we are confronted with counterintuitive puzzles that have an important implication for how to live. I mean, the obvious one is that thing safe to eat? Right? It may taste good, but somebody may have formulated it to taste good, and it may contain ingredients in order to preserve it over some very long supply chain, and it may not be safe to eat, right? It may result in some harm to the body, but it's not obvious by the intuitive pathway an ancestor could have used. So I'm not sure I agree with Aristotle's concern that the fact that you can't just contemplate all day is a problem. I think that may be a feature, not a bug. But I am pretty convinced that our being forced into pointless contemplation is not good for us.
And with regard, I wasn't clear on whether or not the concern about, for instance, we have to sleep, came from Aristotle or from you.
That was what he's trying to posit, is that the soul is immortal and there's something afterwards. And like man's ultimate end, or my reading of it was that there's some end beyond this life. And it makes sense that if the end of human life requires sustained contemplation, that suggests, or it kind of seems to, like, he's not explicit about this, but it kind of seems to suggest that there might be something past this life where one can sustain contemplation, like contemplating truth, beauty, goodness, like, and not just, just like things that are worth contemplating in themselves, not like the practical things, like for the sake of something else. But
I think it's been a long time since I've read Aristotle, but I think I agree with Bret that I don't share his concern particularly, in part because I think that sounds like a similar concern to those now who would dispose of the inconveniences like the body, like the transhumanists. Oh, wouldn't it be nice to have our purest selves moved into the future without the constraints of this decaying thing? Well, no, we are inherently and always and eternally bodied. And there is no, even I would say, and I can't quite put myself into this space because I don't believe this, but even if you believe that there is a way that some part of you will continue on after death, everything that we know about what humans are and what life on Earth is that we always have been in the instantiation that is alive, inherently bodied. And so, what would it be to get rid of the practical, to not have to concern ourselves with food, concern ourselves with relationship and physical connection, concern ourselves with, indeed, sleep. And so, sleep was interesting when you raised it to me because sleep is, we argue this in our book, sleep would be another thing that would be common to sentient life were it to arrive here. It wouldn't be surprising to sentient aliens from another place in the galaxy that we sleep. There will be a lot of things that we do, presumably, that would be surprising. But just as the fact of the long childhoods and the social and the overlap of generations would certainly be features of who they are, because that would have contributed to them having the sentience that they do, that allowed them the technological development that allowed them to get to Earth, they would also sleep, in part because that is when we do so much of our actual contemplation. but it's not at the conscious level. I mean, except when it is, of course, but mostly it's not. Mostly we wake up from sleep and we don't remember what we were doing, but we have learned, and we have grown intellectually in sleep, and take that away, and make that instead time for aroused, in terms of, like, as opposed to sleeping, contemplation, and very quickly the contemplation that you do while you're awake isn't going to be nearly as good.
I also think we can say more about what Aristotle may have been getting at than he would be in a position to. And in fact, I think we can just defend the idea of something afterlife-like. I know that sounds weird, but if we accept that we speak in metaphors where we can't be precise, sometimes those metaphors are fanciful. They're narratives that allow us to remember what we're supposed to do when faced with something counterintuitive. And sometimes they're just approximate. Now, the fact that you will exchange abstractions with your friends, with your family, with your children, and that after you are gone, they will have in them a model of you. They will effectively be able to tap into what you might have thought, look through your eyes, even though you're not there, and that you are in possession of a compendium of knowledge that was generated over who knows how many generations, and that you will contribute something to it, and it will continue. It's like a standing wave, and you're a temporary moment. So I don't know that I want to nitpick the question of whether or not that constitutes an afterlife, but if he's saying there must be something more because at the end of life we are thinking these high-minded thoughts, it must be for something. Well, it is for something. It's something that you leave behind in humanity, and it carries it forward, and hopefully you've done it well enough that it enhances humanity. This is really the point of what I was saying about lineage, right? Once you understand that lineage is actually more real than you are. You as an individual are a temporary thing. Lineage is an indefinite thing, and that indefinite thing is, you're a custodian of it for a moment. And I don't know, that feels like a more precise way of saying, well, there's something that goes on after you're gone.
I also have a question related to us being overly conscious. So what can we do with this peculiar phenomenon of our minds that we can keep asking why even try and propagate our genes into the future? Like, for some reason, it seems that to most of us that this is just not satisfying to contemplate as the end goal. And this seems to be at the root of the meaning crisis. And what do you think will happen? Can we possibly create new stories that somehow transcend this and help us? Or do we just live with this tragic sense and we hope that we don't just annihilate ourselves out of despair? Or will we maybe evolutionarily lose that part of consciousness for which this is so unsatisfying?
Once you realize how pointless the game that evolution sets us onto is, you almost have no choice but to reject it. When I say that your genes are trying to get their spellings into the future, we're talking about the genes that encode enzymes. We're talking about respiratory molecules. A thinking person with values couldn't possibly care whether their spellings of those enzymes get into the future or not. It's not a game worth playing. But the other part of it is that, yes, all creatures have the same objective, to get their genes into the future, but the tools with which to get their genes into the future vary radically. And the ones that humans have been given are tremendous. So we can repurpose ourselves. We can say, I don't really care about this cosmic spelling bee, right? It's not worthy of us. But taking the tools that allow us to seek insight, beauty, to exercise compassion, to enhance the capacity of our species to endure longer on a planet that is fostering of our best characteristics, those are all worthy goals. So we are capable of imposing them on the system and withdrawing our consent from what frankly ends up as a genocidal battle over genetic spellings that nobody even knew about until the last century. So we should do that. But then the weird punchline is the genes want to get into the future. if we keep playing their game in a narrow sense, if we keep battling lineage against lineage, we're not going to survive. Our weapons are too powerful. So if the genes could think, they would want us to do that which allows us to exist as far into the future as we can get, and that does involve putting aside that stupid game. So if the genes could think, they would want us to override them in this case, and in a way they can. They have created us, and our ability to think allows us to say, actually, there's a move that they would not think to make that we can think to make on their behalf.
Who is more complex? Are the genes in control, or are we in control? And are the genes more complex, or are we?
The genes are actually not terribly complex, right? It's a surprisingly simple system, which is actually what surprised scientists most when DNA was discovered and triplet codons. It was shocking how elegant and simple it was to comprehend. The mind, the human mind, is the most complex entity in the known universe. And it is still almost entirely a mystery. The way it functions, we don't know what a thought is. We don't know how a thought is held in the mind. We can say certain things about it. We know how neurons interact with each other, and we know something about the kind of processing of information that they do, but we don't know what a thought is. So the complexity has grown as you get away from the genes into the mind, or into the brain, and then into the mind, which is what the brain does. The mind is what the brain does. That awards us the ability to contemplate the universe and not just respond to it in an automatic way. And so I think the answer to your question is the complexity, and ultimately the control is over in the direction of the mind. But the mind has more control over some things than others. And that, people tend to either believe in free will or not. Now, I am absolutely a believer that there is free will, but a lot less of it than people imagine. We feel freer than we are, right? All that has to be true for the free will folks to be right is that there has to be some free will. And I would argue that a life well lived is one in which you take the small amount of free will that you have and you enlarge it. You free yourself, you free your will. That's the objective, and you still never get totally free. You probably don't get mostly free, but you can free yourself in the direction of things that are worth doing, things that match your conscious values. And I think it's the worthy objective. I can't imagine what else would be a better use of your time.
And I had a quick follow-up question to the one I was just asking, and kind of Danielle's a bit, and following up on something you were arguing for yesterday. You mentioned that there's 7 species that seemed like they have advanced levels of sentience, and man was the only one that has progressed to that degree. Do you think there's something unique about the human soul, or do you simply think that we're just a couple thousand years ahead of all the other animals that could be sentient? So truly sentient?
Yeah, so it's 7 groups of species. It's many more than 7, but it's 7 probably independent evolutions of these characters, these clusters of characters that have selected for, created, both of those words work here, sentience in the organisms that have them. Are we, again, I think the question comes down to, do we see a disjunction? Are humans fundamentally different? Has something separate happened? Has there been a break and then a greater than? I see no evidence for a break. I see no evidence for a particular thing that makes humans different. But are we merely a few thousand years further down a path? No. It's much more than that, and probably, and certainly at this point, given what we have done, given how much we have done on this planet, there is no capacity for anyone else to come anywhere close. And we shouldn't, for instance, expect to see it anywhere that we are dominant, which is almost everywhere, but therefore you might expect to see the most surprising degrees of sentience precisely in the places where we have the least vision, like literally, which is the oceans. And so the whales might actually be the places where we see the most surprising sentience. precisely because we don't have as much access to controlling the landscapes there.
I might argue that that there is kind of a disjunction, and that it's millions, not thousands of years. So if the evidence is correct, we departed from the clade of the chimpanzees about 6 million years ago. So you can imagine that we have a chimp-like ancestor. Chimps do not have language. Somewhere in that 6 million years, something that constitutes a full language evolved. So let's say that that's 2 million years ago, something along those lines. At the point that you have a language capable of allowing individuals to transmit abstractions between minds, you have a tool that no other creature has. And that ability to share an abstraction simply puts us in another category with respect to what we can think, right? A whale may have very powerful thoughts, but how much can it convey to another whale, right? It's limited by the mode of communication. In our case, we can transmit a thought, and that thought might mature over the course of thousands of years, as in the case of Aristotle's thoughts about, contemplation. And, that's just a unique capacity. We really don't know another creature who can do it.
That's true, but I think that's a different definition of the word disjunction. That's what I'm talking about. Do characters evolve? Yes, they do. Are they all continua of what has come before? Inherently not, because new things have happened. So every time a new thing happens, that's a disjunction by that definition, and I think that therefore makes it less interesting.
Yeah.
So, language is absolutely a power that we have that no one else has. I talked about little bits of syntax that some organisms have, but no one pretends that anyone has what we have. And even, there have been some apes, some individual apes that people have tried to teach language to, and they have been surprising in what they can do and utterly unimpressive, actually, in the end, right, compared to what humans can do. There is no full language capacity in anything but humans. But, similarly, just about at the origin of vertebrates, you also have the origin of craniates, you have the origin of brains. There were neurons before, there were diffuse neural networks in some things that are wildly smart, like cephalopods, like octopus and squid, but you didn't have brains before. You had lots of little centers of, like, I'm going to control motor over here, I'm going to control sensory over here, and with the origin of vertebrates and a backbone, we also have just like, let's bring it all together. Let's have a central place where we can organize both the things that are coming in and how to interpret, and then move out into the world. So sensory in, motor out. That was in its time just as remarkable a step in change in evolution as language was much more recently, but still probably millions of years ago.
I have a question about something you said, Dr. Weinstein, where you said that a thinking person of values, this game that the genes is trying to play is not worthy of us. And so I'm just curious, where do we derive those values? Where are we deriving that worth? Because it would seem to imply from that statement that, by virtue of being a human, we're worth something unique. And what is that worth exactly? Is it simply the fact that because we are adapted in such the way that we're adapted, the adaptations of language and things like that, those adaptations give us a certain worth, that we derive the values through adaptation, and that gives us some sense of, that provides the pressure of pressing our genes into the future. Where is that worth or values coming from?
It's a great question. The answer probably won't satisfy. I think this is one of those questions that is very easy to overthink. And I can tell you what I personally do in this space, which is I know that life is amazing, that it is precious. Can I justify that statement? No, I also don't feel compelled to. I just think it feels true, and I know that I am a creature that is confused by my evolutionary history into thinking that things that will propel my genes into the future, that it makes them seem true. But I value life. I infer from the way other people are that they do too, whether they say it or not. It is therefore, I believe, incumbent on us to provide the opportunity to feel that way and to make of life what you will to as many human beings as we can. We are not entitled to limit the number of people who get to have that experience. It does not mean I want to see people packed onto the planet in as large a number as possible. In fact, I think we are obligated to provide future generations with a world at least as good as the one that we inherited, which means that we have to be very deliberate about not overexploiting the planet. Best way to get the most people to have that wonderful experience of life is to make life here sustainable, so we're not degrading the place as we live, and then we can live indefinitely and pass this on, and future generations will know how to make use of that opportunity in ways that we can't imagine. So to me, that seems like a satisfying answer to the question to what I'm supposed to do. Is it philosophically perfectly grounded? I don't know. But you'd be hard-pressed to convince me of something that caused me to override my intuition that that's the right thing, right? I'm pretty sure my intuition is right, even if I don't have the words to explain why. And it's hard for me to imagine that I'm very wrong about that. How can it be wrong to take something that I find precious and try to give it to as many people as possible? That seems like it's bound to be in the neighborhood of correct.
Yeah, I'm going to change the subject a little bit and ask a very selfish question. I'm curious if you have any general thoughts on the state of veterinary medicine, and what practices within it you think are like most of value. Are any of them wasteful? And do you see a lot of like parallel issues to what is happening in human medicine these days?
It's unfortunately all too parallel, I think. There are holistic vets who seem to be making more sense than the standard vets, just as non-allopathic doctors. Not all, but osteopaths and some naturopaths often now are revealing that they have a better ability to think through problems, to diagnose, and also have a better toolkit with which to heal than many of the allopathic doctors. I think the same thing is going to be true of vets. If many people I know here have animals whom they love, I presume you've taken your animals to the vet, and if you've done so recently, you have no doubt been encouraged to give them something exogenous, shots or pills. And because why do you take your animal to the vet? It's either time for their annual shots or there's something wrong with them, and what better to do to fix them than to give them something developed by Merck or whoever it is, right? So that sounds very familiar, doesn't it? So along with the easy, countable, quantifiable, buy it and we'll just make an upcharge and send it on to you model of human medicine, same thing over in veterinary medicine. I also, just as humans have seen a rise, or at least us in the United States have seen a rise in things like allergies and autism and various illnesses as the childhood vaccine schedule has expanded, which we didn't see before, so too have we seen a rise in allergies in our pets. Animals that are now, there's so many specialty diets for our cats and dogs, which didn't exist 30 years ago. There weren't specialty diets for cats and dogs because they couldn't eat chicken or they couldn't eat beef. Why are these animals no longer able to eat these things? It's probably related to the parallel expansion of the pet vaccine schedule.
I have a sort of slightly related question. I've been interested in this idea that in society we seem to try to essentially go against natural selection in many ways. Like essentially with like modern medicine, like we try to save as many people as we can. We want to help the people who are living in poor, like not great areas, even if they're not very healthy or not not as many opportunities as other people. And so I'm just curious, I don't know if this is a very clear question, but I'm curious about this sort of phenomenon that we see in trying to stop natural selection within humanity, and what you would have to say to that.
And we're buying French bulldogs.
Well, one thing that brings up is that again with the counting, we we end up favoring the things that we can count. And so we favor, just as we did during COVID, but in exactly the sorts of situations you're talking about, we favor being able to say, this many people are still alive, as opposed to this much quality of life has been enhanced. Because you inherently cannot quantify quality, right? You can figure out what proxies are and you can count those up and you can try to get an amalgam, proxy that works, but it's inherently not quantifiable. That's the nature of the conflict between the two ideas. So if what you're trying to do is get a better result, better, if you want to measure it, requires numbers. And the numbers are more likely to be things like length of life or amount of life, but what makes for a better life? Those are not the things that are measured. And I don't know that I see that as a conflict with regard to natural selection exactly, but it feels anti-human, and it feels reductionist and mechanistic and antithetical to a good life and a good society.
Your question is a good one, and it's one that many people have worried about. But I think actually we're coming to understand that our design is better than we knew, and so the concern you're talking about is probably not as significant as people have feared. And I'll give you one example. You can think about this with respect to correcting bad vision. Right? People have eyes that don't function quite right, and we put lenses on them that make them function approximately right, leveling the playing field. They're as likely to reproduce, pass on bad genes. Maybe our eyesight is going to degrade over time. It seems like a rational fear. Doesn't seem to be what's happening. What seems to be what's happening is that we've disrupted the developmental environment in which eyes correct themselves. This is what they probably don't teach you about eyes in school, is that having good vision as an adult is a matter of allowing your approximate eye to take feedback from the world and fix itself. The muscles in the eye actually reshape it so that to the extent that it is distorted, it gets less distorted. Your vision will correct itself. And instead,
with the exception that, as we were talking about last night, if you've arrived at adulthood with a diopter of like -3.5 or -6.5, you can't do that. You can't walk around the world and not get hit by a bus.
Oh, right. This is absolutely the case. I don't think we've come up with a solution to this problem. Do you deny the kid with bad vision glasses so that their eyes will correct themselves, and in the meantime they will fall behind their peers in terms of what they can interpret of the world? I don't think we know the answer to the question. But once you know that the problem is developmental, then the answer is, well, we really ought to be putting our energies there, because that's actually a readily addressable problem without some sort of a moral crisis denying people treatment that they might be given in order for natural selection to do its job. I think that's a dead end, and figuring out all of the ways in which we've broken the developmental environment and are causing people to be poorly constructed to function, those are things that we could start fixing today. And if we did, we could put off that other question for the remote future, if it's even a reasonable question at that point.
And I think this is maybe something that we haven't made explicit so far, which is that this is where there is so much hope inherent in how we see the world, which is that actually, for humans, more than any other species on the planet, our genes don't define what we become. We're not blank slates upon being born, as briefly some people believed, but we are, as we say in the book, the blankest slates of all of the organisms out there. We have the most potential to become, greater and less than what this uninteresting spellings of our genes would tell us we will become. And so, even in terms of things like height are affected by diet, and that's kind of an obvious one. So, if we know that you're more likely to be nearsighted if you spend a lot of time inside growing up, and that if you don't get good enough nutrients growing up, you're likely to be shorter than you could have been. And if you don't chew on hard things as a baby, you're likely to end up needing braces and have to have your wisdom teeth pulled. Like some of these things that we now know those. How many more don't we know? So let us figure out as much as possible how to retain as much of the best of humanity from before while still using the advancements that aren't actually dangerous that we have now. But that's the fine line to walk, figuring out which of the so-called examples of progress are not actually progress at all, are actually dangerous.
I want to add one thing to that. It's sort of it's such an important key to living a better life. It belongs here. Industry after industry, discipline after discipline has fed us a bill of goods, and it sounds the same. There's some kind of malady, and it is dismissed as the result of bad genes which are spreading through the population, for which you need some kind of a physical or chemical remedy. It is essentially always a garbage explanation. The idea that mental illness is spreading in the population because you just might have gotten unlucky. Maybe you got the schizophrenia gene, right? Or, well, I don't know why so many more kids need braces now than they did 50 years ago. I guess the bad genes for misformed jaws are just spreading through the population. It's never true. And you know it's never true because the rate of spread of the malady is too fast for genes spreading across a population to do it. It's thousands of times too fast. It's always the result of some influence that we are exerting on the system that is harming children, and that's a terrifying thing to realize. But once you do, you realize that actually that's a problem we can solve, like almost right away.
Since we're talking about children and do's and don'ts, I had a question about nutrition. I don't know if you have some wisdom to share in this topic, but I think we have a massive nutrition problem in this country. I was wondering if there are some specific food groups that you see a problem with, specifically children just being accustomed to just eating every single day, and if there anything that you would change in a traditional American diet, some brands or some processed goods. I think we're just used to just having food made for us, and as you said yesterday, we're off nature, and there's something beautiful about just taking care of your own body, taking care of the food that actually comes from the earth and everything that is provided if we are off nature. So yeah, if you have any wisdom to share in this topic.
We could go on for months on this one. We say, I think at the beginning of the food chapter of Hunter-Gatherer's Guide, that there is no best diet for humans. Because consider how many different ways humans live on this planet. If both the Maasai, who drink a lot of blood of the animals that they also drink a lot of milk of, exist, and the Bushman San, who are more typical hunter-gatherers, who both eat dug roots and leaves and hunt small and large game, and the Inuit, who have no vegetable matter in their diets at all, really, all exist as healthy human populations, dwindling, but healthy human populations, then that tells you right away that there's not a single universal best. However, are there absolutely universal toxins for humans? Yes. And as Michael Pollan said in Omnivore's Dilemma, which is a terrific book if you don't know it, if your grandmother, and the book was written in I think 2008, so at some point it's going to have to be your great grandmother. But if your grandmother wouldn't recognize it as food, it's not food. Don't eat it. Shop around the perimeter of the supermarket, which is to say, stuff in the middle is in the middle because it's shelf stable, and the shelf stabilizers are known, some of them known to be neurotoxins. That's just what we know. There's a lot we don't know. So everything from the food dyes to the new forms of preservation. There are traditional forms of preservation, like eat ferment, eat meat, eat ferment, eat leaves and fruit, and complex carbs are a healthy part of a diet for many people. But the modern ways that we Americans are growing our grains are often not healthy. Bret can't eat American wheat, but it turns out he can't eat European wheat. Right? And that's in part because probably we have bred our wheat to be so high in protein that it is more likely to trigger a response, basically an immune response. And why did we do that? Because really high protein wheat lasts longer as it's traveling in the form of bread. And so you can put a high protein wheat bread on a supermarket shelf and still have it taste good-ish, 5 days later. Whereas bread from a bakery, a real loaf of bread, the next day it doesn't taste very good, right? Bread doesn't last. Bread's not supposed to last. So again, I mean, in this case, it's both literal and metaphorical. Trust your gut, right? Like, you know, if you can purify your diet, if you can do a kind of elimination diet back to actual real food, where you can point to, you know, few ingredients, and you better if, you know, you grow it yourself, or you know the farmers, the ranchers, or whatever, and start to see how different you feel. But it will take a while for almost all of us. You know, most of us are eating a little bit of something that's very modern every day, and so it's going to take a while to actually get clean. But it's amazing how different many people feel at the point that they do.
Would it be more important to buy like organic vegetables or like farm-raised meat? And I know organic is a little bit problematic, but where do you put your money when you can't get the best version of everything?
It's a very good question. There are some vegetables that are more important organic than others. Things like strawberries and peppers, where strawberries, because you can't not eat the seeds, and the seeds are where many of the pesticides and agrochemicals are taken up. And so if you're going to buy strawberries, you want organic strawberries. Peppers, I'm not sure why, because you can get rid of the seeds, but peppers also, you really want organic. There's also the question of, you know, did the animal, if you're talking about meat, did it eat the diet of its ancestors? Much as did we eat the diet? Are we eating the diet of our ancestors? Grain-fed beef is a new thing, and eating grain-fed beef is not going to kill you, but it's also that animal was not as healthy as it should have been. And so, do you want to eat meat that came from an animal that was healthy when it died, or do you want to eat meat that came from an animal that was sick when it died? That said, eating the healthiest stuff is more expensive.
I would also just add that there's a question about how much value to place on higher quality food. And I have the sense that if we understood the price that we ultimately pay for making compromises in this realm, we would pay the premium, that it would be worth it in terms of years of life and quality of life gained for having done that, which is a hard thing to do. It's gotten better. Consciousness about things like residual pesticides has grown. But, you know, initially the argument by those who were producing the so-called conventionally grown foods, which are really not conventionally grown at all, but their argument was, well, the organic competitor isn't any more nutritious. And that may actually technically be right. It doesn't have more nutrients necessarily, but it doesn't mean that it's not exactly what you want, because your risk of Parkinson's disease drops radically if you're not consuming the residual pesticides. And the more you learn about this, the more you realize that even in the organic foods, it's hard to get something that actually truly matches the ancestral food and is therefore likely to be healthy. But, you know, with respect to a food that's had a pesticide sprayed on it, you're depending on the science that said that that pesticide was safe, which is almost certainly flawed, if not fraudulent. And you are depending on your ability to get rid of the pesticide. Are you going to do that by washing it? Don't you think that the pesticide that they put on that food was able to endure a rainstorm? And therefore, how are you going to wash it with soap? Is that even going to work? I mean, once you realize this, you become more frightened of food that has been through some industrial process, and for good reason.
I guess one more answer. You know, you asked sort of I don't remember what the word you used was, but basically what categories of food maybe are better or worse. And you know, there are a lot of ways to categorize food, and some of them are products of precisely the system that isn't actually interested in our health. But if you just take the so-called macros, you know, proteins, fats, and carbs, more protein is almost always better. Many of the fats that are available to us are bad, right? So again, if your grandmother would have recognized it as real food, then it's probably real food. And there are a couple to add to that. So because no one's grandmother came from both, came from Italy and Korea and and Switzerland probably. Butter is real, and ghee is real, and all the tallows and lards, and olive oil and sesame oil, and then also a new one that I don't think anyone really is in anyone's cultural tradition, but avocado oil is also fine. Seed oils, no. In part because other than sesame oil, if you find no culinary tradition that was doing it, there is probably a reason why. And what that further points to is how all of the so-called nutrition has been extracted from seed oils is through a combination of detergents and then cleansings and then perfumes in order to obscure the fact that this is actually poison that you're eating. And it's basically impossible not to eat seed oils if you're eating out in the world. And so we all will eat some seed oils sometimes if we want to not be hermits. But just the growing awareness of what this one particular class of very cheap fat is, that's across all of at least American cuisine. There's growing awareness just in the last 2 years, 5 years. And there are ways now to let restaurants know, actually, yes, I would like to have French fries sometimes, but I'd prefer them fried in tallow. It's hard to get that to happen, but it's beginning to happen. So change can happen, and it is.
So, what are your opinions on alcohol then?
It's a toxin, and we drink it. Yeah.
Did a lot of culture, wasn't that something that culturally people would have?
Absolutely. Not every culture, but many cultures.
Even in scripture, Christ drank wine and things like.
Yeah.
So realize that initially it's the solution to a problem, right? It is a preservation technique. You can take something that isn't shelf stable and you can make it shelf stable. From there, we develop a tolerance for it. So to say it's a toxin is technically true, but we're capable of processing that toxin well if we come from a population that has a history of drinking these things. But then you end up doing something like distilling it, right? If we're capable of tolerating alcohol in moderation at 12%, right? But then you distill it down, then you're making something that is again capable of harming you, which you can then dilute it with things. You can make a cocktail or something like that. But anyway, the point is, many things that we consume are actually cryptic food preservation technologies, right? When we can foods, when we make jam and jelly, when we salt meats, all of these things are mechanisms for solving a seasonal problem.
Or a transport problem.
Or a transport problem. And anyway, they create the basis for cuisine. And I don't think we can question it terribly much. Almost certainly, a certain amount of alcohol in moderation isn't a big deal. Obviously, too much alcohol quickly has impacts on your life, both in terms of how well you live it and how healthy you are doing so. But in general, I think the fact that most human cultures have a tradition with alcohol and have gotten to the present is an indication that it's not terrible in and of itself.
And how about caffeine?
Caffeine's actually probably good for you. Not in the form of Red Bull, but in tea, in coffee, and chocolate. Coffee and chocolate are rather new. They're both New World plants that didn't make it to the rest of the world until sometime after 1492. I don't know when exactly they were taken back, but they were being used by the New World peoples before that. Actually, I don't know about coffee. I don't know when coffee was, but chocolate certainly was being used ceremonially by the Aztec before it ever made it to the rest of the world. Tea, of course, is ancient. So there are several plants that have solid amounts of caffeine in them that have long-standing culinary traditions. And in coffee in particular, there's actually good research, I think it is, that shows that it is not only not bad for you, but actually neuroprotective against degenerative diseases like Alzheimer's. Not 8 cups a day, probably.
Yeah, I would say at the point that you can't go cold turkey on coffee without causing yourself a headache, that's nature's way of telling you you're drinking too much. But
I mean, you guys laugh, but this is when I used to run study abroad trips, and I did my first one in Ecuador. We had 2 weeks at a field station deep in the Amazon, and they would sometimes run out of coffee, and there was no alcohol at all because you just don't. Because when you're that deep in the Amazon, you don't want people who've never been there before experimenting with alcohol. But in leading up to the preparations, I would say, look, if you think 2 weeks is going to be hard to go without alcohol, we should talk because you have a different kind of problem, and you should, even if you drink every day when you're home, if you can't go 2 weeks without, then that's an indication of a problem, and let's use this as a learning experience. But with regard to coffee, it's not a problem if you drink coffee every day, but if you're going to get a migraine, if you skip a day or skip 3 days, then that is your indication that you've got an addiction that you should scale back. So that you need to be able to do a day or more without anything that you're used to doing. And if it kills everything else about your system, well, then you need to wean yourself.
Thank you so much for all the insights about making medical decisions and vaccines in particular. How do you go about it as someone who's rationally minded and not necessarily denying the potential efficacy of some interventions, but also understanding the perverse incentives in the system nowadays? Do you have any advice or resources?
I think I missed the first noun in the first sentence. With regard to any kind of interventions or?
Yes, and vaccines in particular.
Oh, vaccines, okay.
Heather and I have gotten a graduate education in modern medicine and iatrogenic harm through COVID, and it has been a painful series of lessons. But I'll speak personally, you can say whether you agree with this or not. I have the sense that allopathic medicine, that's mainstream MD medicine, is basically traveling under the reputation of the surgeons. That we all know that if you get into a terrible accident, that you want a surgeon who knows what they're doing to put you back together. They're very good at it. And that gives the impression that medicine knows a tremendous amount about the body and that it knows how to make things better when something is wrong with you. And overwhelmingly, I think we are discovering that allopathic medicine is suffering from the most ungodly case of hubris imaginable, and that it is very hard to improve human health through intervention. Almost always the solution to a problem that is solvable is to figure out what the root cause is and remove the offending compound or practice, and that our addiction to technological remedies is going to prove to, it really calls into question whether or not medicine as a whole has been a net benefit to humanity. I really don't know the answer to that question, but I grow more doubtful every week. So empirically, I can say we have become very reluctant to go to a doctor. And the doctors we go to, we try to choose ones that are capable of having a basic conversation about unintended consequences and side effects that does not violate evolutionary logic. It's hard to find those doctors. But I would say avoid intervention. Intervention is a last resort. And intervention, to the extent that you are forced to it, is not a good plan if there's no off-ramp. Right? A temporary intervention to correct a problem, that can work. But if the idea is, oh, you have a defect and we're going to give you a remedy, oh, when do I stop taking it? No, you're going to have to keep taking it. That sounds like somebody misunderstood the body, and I would walk out the door unless I had no choice.
So viruses are real, right? Bacteria are real. There have been plagues of infectious disease that have taken out large portions of the population in human history. Some of those stories are not what they seem. The Spanish flu in the early 20th century does not turn out to be what it seemed. That may be another case of iatrogenic harm in which the treatment for people who had come down with the Spanish flu was aspirin? Aspirin in such large doses that it killed people.
Doses that are now known to be toxic.
They weren't trying to kill people, much as presumably most of the doctors who put people on ventilators early in COVID weren't trying to kill people. They were doing what they understood to be was the standard of care, but it was exactly the wrong thing to do. Absolutely exactly the wrong thing to do. Just as I think every one of the new pharmaceutical products that came out in the wake of COVID, which is itself a pharmaceutical product in its way, it's at least a product of research, was more harmful than good. There are drugs on the market that were useful, but they were older drugs. And so we refer to them as repurposed for this. So as of 5 years ago, we were fully vaccinated. We were vaccinated against rabies because Bret worked on bats and I spent time in those forests too, and we're vaccinated against yellow fever because you have to be to get into some of the deeper parts of the Amazon and all the other stuff. And at this point, given what we now know about how modern vaccines are made, how many adjuvants they have in them, whose job it is specifically to inflame the immune system into responding to the active part of the vaccine, I hope never to get another vaccine. And we have both apologized to our children for, even though we delayed as long as possible, we already knew, you don't want, pregnant women should never get any vaccines no matter what. And you don't want to give newborns exogenous things as much as possible. So we delayed with our children, who are now 19 and almost 21, but they ended up with the full complement just a little later. And I wish we hadn't. They don't have any obvious injuries from it, but allergies, dietary intolerances, it's probably about the vaccines.
So on that note, I wonder, are we completely ruling out the idea of a respiratory disease started by bats? And you guys like bats. Is that off the table?
No, but the virus clearly came from bats. The question is, what was the intermediate host? Was it some animal that we haven't found? That is almost certainly not the case.
The original virus.
The original virus came from bats, and I think we can tell a pretty good story about what likely happened. The intermediate host appears to have been a laboratory, right? And I don't say that tongue-in-cheek. The fact is, you need some place in which a virus that's good at infecting bats and spreading between them learns the trick of how to get into and spread between people. And having not been able to find it, with all of the effort that's been put into looking for it, it suggests that process took place in some way that has not left us evidence we can find. And the way that would happen is in a laboratory that we're not allowed to look into. So I think the idea of a natural spillover is just about off the table. The evidence, there's not a single piece of evidence that I'm aware of that points in favor of a natural spillover. All of the evidence that we're able to find points in the direction of a lab. We have a grant proposal that describes the exact process that would have produced COVID. Now, the grant wasn't funded, so that's the thing people point to. But Heather and I learned something else about science that we didn't know in this process, which is that the lab folks tell us that oftentimes when a grant proposal is filed, the work has already been done. That there's something about the nature of the funding cycle that causes people to do research and solicit a grant for it during or afterwards.
So they're basically trying to get reimbursed for work that they already did.
So I don't spend any time worrying that we're going to find this animal in nature. I'm all but certain that this is a laboratory leak or worse.
On perhaps a slightly more hopeful note, I'm very curious about this idea of humans being the blankest slate that is offered in sentient life having the longest childhoods. With both of your experience as evolutionary biologists, how did that change your approach to parenthood and your intentionality in how to manifest that in the childhoods of your children?
Again, a big, wonderful question. You want to start?
Sure. Kids are built to be parented. That's something that you should go into the process knowing. They are also fault tolerant, right? As a parent, you will screw up repeatedly, right? And you will come to understand that you've done something in a way that you realize, oh, that doesn't make any sense if I'm trying to give this person the tools for life. But of course, this is always the case. It's very difficult to know exactly in the moment how to reinforce the right patterns and to discourage the wrong ones. And so the way I think about it is this. You're trying to give a child a very high signal to noise ratio, right? You want them to be able to deduce the message that you're trying to convey to them, or that you want the world to convey to them. And for that to be true, the number of instances in which the thing is crystal clear has to far exceed the number of ones in which you've sent an erroneous or uninterpretable message. I would also say there's tremendous value in allowing your children to learn the lesson without your presence in the process. So I'll just give you the example of how we taught our kids to drive. We decided they should learn to drive stick shift so you can rent a car anywhere on earth. And the process of teaching them to drive mostly consisted of finding a place where it was safe for them to make errors and then just letting them do it, sitting there.
I was not involved.
Not commenting on their errors unless there was some reason to. If there was something not intuitive about the way they were using the clutch and it was causing a problem, might say something. But in general, just letting them go through the process of making errors and figuring out what causes the car to stall less often, right?
And they both just rented cars in Spain, and they're driving in Europe. They're friends, so most American kids can't drive stick, so. It worked.
Yeah, there's no substitute for the feedback that is direct between you and the world. What you want is to provide an environment in which it's safe to experience that feedback. You don't want your kid dying because, a mistake on the road is, potentially a life-ending thing. But you provide an environment in which you can make mistakes, in which you can get hurt. Right? There are lots of endeavors in which you'll get hurt, and the fact that you fell off your bike teaches you some lesson about the thing that you thought was okay to do. A kid who's learned from the world in an environment that puts bounds on how hurt they can get is a kid that's going to be wise about managing risk as an adult, and that's kind of the point of the exercise.
So one of the effects of being the blankest slates is that if you protect them from everything, if you wrap them in bubble wrap and you make sure that the world can't hurt them because your only goal is that they actually are alive on their 18th birthday. They will be alive on their 18th birthday. And they'll look like an adult, but they won't have the brain of an adult. They'll have the brain, the wisdom, the morals probably of a child. And then, and I'm sure all of you met some people like this in college. They walk around looking like you, the same age, but they have no wisdom at all because they were the combination of, just helicopter parented and, protected because the only thing that matters is nothing happens to my precious baby. Because one of the other things that is true of all of these usual suspects, and including us, and across primate history, is we get smaller and smaller clutch sizes. We tend to have singletons. And some of us still have very big families, but we have one child at a time. And there's so much investment. That is such a long gestation and lactation. And they're born so helpless, they can't even roll over. That is so much investment. And of course, we care more deeply about every single individual than any other species on Earth cares about any single individual, even though, the orcas and the elephants, and, they care deeply when their children die as well. But I do think we care the most. We have the most investment. And we can, again, with accounting, right? What can I measure? Alive or dead? Is that the most important thing? For sure. And, we've known parents who lost children. I don't know how you continue on. I don't know. I hope never to know.
Well.
So giving a child, knowing that they are the blankest slate and that you have to let them, expose them with your own wisdom to experiences that will involve risk and that may result in tragedy, means that at the point that they hit 18, which they're still extremely likely to do, but just a little bit less likely than if you wrapped them in bubble wrap, they're also going to be wise and exploratory and fun-loving and joy-giving and all of the other things that we want humans to be.
I have two more questions. One more question, actually, about nutrition. What do you think about products who are just natural products and then they're changed to make them look healthier? For instance, just whole milk yogurt and Greek zero fat yogurt. Some people say that the zero Greek fat yogurt will be worse for you because the processes that it goes through in order for it to be zero fat, it's actually worse for you than if you just have whole milk or whole yogurt or just cheese, normal cheese. And the same thing with for also processed goods like soda. If you have just Coke and if you have like zero Coke, the fact that like zero Coke tastes it's as like even sweeter sometimes than just normal Coke, it would make like that's a sign that perhaps the zero Coke is even worse for you because it's like no calories, and so they're adding more stuff to make it taste the same. So if you have any thoughts on how to navigate products that look like they're healthier, but they're more processed.
One answer is fat is not the enemy. Fat doesn't make you fat. Seed oils might, but real fat isn't the thing that makes you fat. Mostly that's carbs. Taking the fat out of a product that inherently had fat is going to yield a product that is not, your body doesn't know what to do with. Same thing with, and this is more controversial, but I feel certain, as certain as I get on these topics, that it's true, that pasteurizing milk makes it less healthy for you. It makes it a little bit more safe. But the pasteurization process, which kills off the bacteria, but also all of the living good for you stuff of milk, and also the homogenization process, which basically you use centrifuge and you make all the droplets the same size, and so your body is now taking in a uniform product. You want to challenge your body just like you want to, your guts just like you want to challenge every part of you. Give it different sizes and living things to process. And with regard to Coke, I would say neither. But certainly, fake sugar is terrible. Sugar isn't good for you. Sugar's a toxin, and unlike alcohol, alcohol has showed up ceremonially and just socially in so many cultures, except in the distilled form. But the ways that we have been able to refine sugar from beet and sugarcane is pretty new. And I bake, I eat sugar. So I say that not as someone who says you should never do that, but it's not good for you. But it's a lot better for you. Maple syrup, honey, best for you if you're going to be eating sweeteners. Refined sugar, not very good for you, but way better than something like aspartame. Dangerous, neurotoxin.
I would just add to that there is this strange double standard in society, in the market, in which there is an obsession about short-term safety and a complete indifference to long-term safety. So the idea that pasteurized milk is better for you, that does protect you from the very rare instance of getting listeria, which can be serious on a very short time scale. On the other hand, its long-term impact on your physiology, we're not bothering to notice it and to compare the two dangers. So I have become doubtful about how genuine the concern over our short-term well-being is, given how profound the indifference to our long-term well-being. And I think you're really better off on your own with a strong bias in favor of anything truly novel being considered a significant hazard. And, in the case of, should you be drinking Coke Zero or regular Coke, this is an easy one. Just get rid of them both, right? You don't really give up that much quality of life if you develop a taste for unsweetened iced tea. Is it?
Or shrubs. Shrubs are good.
Or a shrub.
That's another fermented, you could just add some sparkling water.
But that's just an immediate upgrade where you can just take a bunch of risk for yourself off the table on both sides of that equation. And I think you'll be happier if you do. It's hard to maintain discipline over your entire diet. So the places where it's easy and cheap to just eliminate some novel influence, those are a slam dunk.
And with the recently, there's been a lot of different kinds of sugars that have come onto the market. I think coconut sugar and date sugar and things. Do you think those are better than cane sugar, or like if honey and maple syrup are the best things? Do you have opinions on the other types of sugars?
I haven't looked into it, but I guess my suspicion is they're about on a par with beet sugar and cane sugar, maybe slightly better given that they're not being produced in as great an abundance. And so the quality of production may be higher, but I don't know.
The danger with sugar generally is that because it would have been limiting in any ancestral environment, we do not have a good system for saying when we've had enough. We're not built to turn it down because in general for ancestors that were in danger of starvation, a bunch of extra calories, hey, you can put those on at fat, and if it's as fat, and then if it's a bad winter, you got those extra calories available and it might just get you through. So we're built poorly with respect to the abundance of things like sugar that we have available to us. And this is a place where you have to sort of intervene on your own behalf and set those limits consciously.
We could tag back to what you were just speaking about with regards to loss. And last night you mentioned orcas and elephants. And I think a lot of us were very touched by the vigils that the elephants held in the orca mom story. And I'm just wondering how unique is a type of grieving that involves burial? Because I know for a long time we thought we were maybe the only ones who did that. And then recently we're like, oh, Homo naledi also had these types of rituals. So that's one question. And then the other that we kind of began to get to is, what is the purpose of grief, evolutionarily speaking? Does it, I'm guessing, maybe has something to do with passing on that legacy, that type of next life from the lineage that's more important than you, that you're just a placeholder in, as you mentioned. But I can see also a huge drawback in taking time to grieve. And so what is the balance kind of between that? What's evolution doing there?
Think about it this way. You are, well, first of all, if you study grief, even just informally study your own grief, if you lose someone or something like a pet that you value deeply, you'll notice that the pattern of grief is not what you would expect, just sort of a debilitating sadness that goes on and on. The pattern is something that ebbs and flows. If you go to a funeral, you will see people joking and smiling and crying, and those things are sort of interspersed with each other. So we grieve intensely, and then our mind moves on to something else. It allows us some room to think about other things, and then we will return to grief. It doesn't tend to afflict you when you've got something in front of you that needs to get accomplished or something bad will happen. So the mind is capable of corralling your grief to moments when you can afford to do it. And I think the thing to understand, the thing that's counterintuitive about it, is grief is probably not an adaptation in and of itself. The form that it takes is how you can grieve in a way that doesn't disrupt your ability to function. That's adaptive. But grief, as Heather said in her second talk, is the downside of love. If you have an interdependence with somebody and they die, especially unexpectedly, well, now you have a problem because their relationship to you, the way in which they were going to interface with all of the things that were going to happen going forward in your life, all of those plans have to change. All of the dependence that you had on them has to be effectively unwired. And there's no simple way to do that because they were interwoven into your cognition in innumerable ways. So you can imagine as you discover that this person you were expecting to be there isn't going to be, that there's a pattern of discovery of, oh, well, that means this. Oh, and it means that. And so that unwiring is going to take time. So is love worth the downside of being at risk of losing somebody you thought was going to be there and needed? Yeah, it is, but it's not a small cost. So we pay that cost over time because the benefit of love itself is so great. All right, we can't avoid the grief. It's worth paying the price, and we grieve in the most adaptive way possible, but it is really the downside of something very beneficial rather than a positive thing in and of itself.
On the nature of love, I have more of a perhaps personal question for the two of you. I think something that you're offering to the world publicly, like through your podcast, through your appearances and talks, is not just the evolutionary knowledge and wisdom that you both share, but also your willingness to go about this endeavor together as a united couple. And so I'm wondering, what sort of principles do you both abide by, or what is it that so strongly unites the two of you together such that you can be a force for good, like you're doing right now with all of us, so publicly?
I'll start. We got together very early, and we did a lot of adventuring together. And so there's a way in which, we were, 18 or 19 when we got together?
19 or 20. Well, we knew each other in high school,
Yeah,
but it was
we knew
several
each other.
years before we were together.
But in any case, all of that adventuring, that's still very much in, sort of the last phase of your development. And so we became a team, and we survived that period as a couple and thrived because we were able to figure out a dynamic that worked where, we could take care of each other and figure out each other's quirks and all of those things. And so I guess what I would say is I think there's a pseudo-sophistication that what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to, have relationships with a bunch of people, and then eventually at some point you're going to have to settle down because you probably want some kids. And I'm not saying that that's incorrect fundamentally, but I am saying there's a big downside to that, which is by the time you settle down, you've bypassed the period in which you might have built a really strong team relationship with somebody at a developmental level. And in retrospect, I couldn't be happier. I worried initially that getting together so early, it's like, when you meet the right person, you meet the right person, but it's a little unfortunate that it was so early. But I now don't feel that way at all. I feel like that was a tremendous benefit, and we got lucky in that regard.
So let me, yeah. So we were actually 20. It was between sophomore and junior years of college. So we both had other experiences. It wasn't, but we know we know people who are with their high school sweethearts who really had never been with anyone else. And I'm thrilled when that works. But I do think that knowing what some of what else is out there looks like is useful. That said, one of the things that we have done besides exploring together a lot is also exploring apart. And the value of that is that when you're now either maybe, and both of us have been the person back home, both, sometimes with the kids as the other person is out, and also before we had kids, we both did, I was working in Madagascar, Bret was working in Panama. And one thing that does is, we're very frustrating people because we're people. And we have our quirks and our particularities. And when you're living with someone, you come to get very irritated by the way that they leave the sink or the dishes or the whatever it is, right? And when you have somewhat regular opportunities, especially early on, to be in your same space but without the person, and you realize, oh, that wasn't him. that thing that I was getting so frustrated at, that's life, or that's me, it turns out, or whatever it is. So actually, there is real value in being incredibly close and exploring together, and also having time, exploratory time apart, where you have to be very honest with yourself about what you're seeing. And if I'm still frustrated by the same things, then that wasn't my partner. And so as I move forward being frustrated, I need not put that on his account.
And in my defense, I will say I'm terrible at a lot of stuff, but I'm great with the dishes.
That's true.
I apologize for this question being a bit of a downer, but going back to the idea of launching your dreams into the future, what do you make of population collapse in places such as Japan or Korea?
Well, we're dealing with the capacity to choose whether or not to reproduce, and we were not built to navigate that, right? The fact that, as I mentioned in my talk, the ability to separate the act of sex, which is very motivating, from reproduction, which is an abstraction, allows human beings to choose whether or not to reproduce. And so there's nothing that says that this pattern is sustainable, and I think there's every reason to wonder what's going on. There's also a lot of apparent interference with our physiology that comes from whatever the technological inputs to our system are, dropping sperm counts and testosterone levels and things like that. As for the question of what the population should be, we are stuck in a trap where our system is predicated on assumptions that require the population to grow. And so there are some very real fears about what happens when your population begins to decline. there's no reason that we can't live as a smaller population on this planet if that's the right thing to do, but our economic system won't let us do that. And I think that we have to separate those two questions. Why is the population dropping, and is it a good idea for us to live in the way that we are living, to consume the things that we are consuming? That's one question. And how the hell did we sign up for an economic system that doesn't give us a choice about whether or not our population can grow? That is ultimately going to, if we're not already destroying the planet in a way that it can't be recovered, we soon will be. And so we should separate those two things and navigate them independently.
Yeah, I don't have a clear answer, but one thing I've said is that I do feel like we are experiencing simultaneously two population problems that go in opposite directions. That we have, there are many places in the world where the population density is so high that the quality of life is inherently low. And this isn't good for the people living it. And this is not an invitation to genocide. It is just an observation that the population density is so high and there's so few resources that the people are not living good and meaningful lives. Then we also have many of the countries of the industrialized world where the numbers are dropping below replacement level. That's going to have very real effects, especially given that these are the very countries that have been the most productive at the intellectual level. So, how could that possibly result in something good? I don't know. And that's, you introduced this as it's not a very hopeful question, and it's hard to wrap. For me, it's hard to wrap my brain around how can there be two simultaneous population problems in opposite directions, and doesn't that sound elitist? No, I don't think it's elitist. I think it's humanist to observe that the quality of life in both cases, where there aren't going to be enough young people around to support the aging generation here, and there are just too many people for anyone to live a good life over here, and neither of those situations is good for the people living those lives.
If I can ask one more question, just as sort of a closing question. Now that you've spent this week with us at Ralston, I would just love to know your perspective on Ralston, which I think is a pretty unique place, and sort of what maybe Ralston's doing well, or what we as students are doing well by being here, but also what we might be missing as students, where Ralston's this wonderful place, but what you bring a very different perspective to what we're learning in the classroom, to what we might want to pursue moving forward, what we might be missing, what we're doing well. I would really love to hear your perspectives.
You guys are doing something extraordinary here. I mean, like, really, every single experience we've had, we've come away and we're like, we didn't think that there was a place left where the kinds of talent and inquiry and rigor and humanism
and community
were still present, at least in the United States, and maybe anywhere. And we've told Stephen this, and I thank you for asking that, because I really did want to communicate that to you, that there is something incredibly special here. Well, I could say so much more, but
I will just say I've been hesitant about saying to you all what it is that we see. I sort of wish that you could listen into the conversations that we've had as we've walked away from each of the events. I think you'd like what you heard, and we don't mince words, so we've seen something that has really impressed us. But I also feel that I don't want to take any risk of jinxing it, right? I don't want to put things into your head about what is succeeding and failing that could have any chance of disrupting what you're doing. Now, I realize you're coming to the end of your year here, and so you're going to part ways, and I would, I guess, give you a couple of pieces of advice. One is, there's something you'll notice in life as you experience things and travel, which is that things have a way of being exceedingly real when you're there, and receding surprisingly fast when they are over, right? They seem like the world when you're involved in them, and then they seem like some distant thing later. And it is important when you have a really profound experience to struggle to preserve it so that it remains real for you as long as possible and in as many ways as possible. So I don't know if that involves just staying in contact with each other or what it might be, but I recommend it. The other thing is, I worry with people your age that it seems like you are joining the world of adults. There are no adults. And you guys are very, very hopeful to see, because you are maturing in a way that most people just never do. So I would encourage you to figure out how to know who to trust. And for those people who are up to the challenge, do so more than your instinct would normally tell you. And for those people who aren't up to the challenge, don't, right? You need to figure out who in your generation has the toolkit, because you guys are going to figure out what we do with the mess that is being made of the planet. And I think there's a lot of talent here that, we may be depending on you to figure this out, because you have skills at this age that most people just don't. So good luck and follow your gut.